The morning sun painted the Missouri River in shades of gold and amber as Sarah Mitchell gathered her worn woolen shawl around her shoulders. At 19, she had already learned that life on the frontier was unforgiving, but nothing had prepared her for the crushing weight of betrayal that now pressed against her chest like a stone. Her husband of 6 months, Thomas, stood beside their covered wagon with his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line that meant his mind was made up. "You're leaving me here?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper, though inside she was screaming. The small trading post where they had stopped to resupply looked more like a collection of rough wooden buildings thrown together by accident than any place where civilized people might live. Beyond it, the vast prairie stretched endlessly, broken only by the winding ribbon of the Missouri River that had brought them this far west. Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. Instead, he focused on adjusting the canvas covering of their wagon, his calloused hands working the ropes with unnecessary force. "It's for the best, Sarah. You've been nothing but trouble since we left Independence. Always complaining, always slowing us down. The other families in the wagon train are tired of waiting for you." Sarah felt her world tilting sideways. When Thomas had asked her to marry him back in Ohio, she had thought herself the luckiest girl alive. He was handsome enough, with broad shoulders and steady work at the lumber mill. Her parents had approved of the match, especially when Thomas spoke of his plans to head west and claim land in Oregon Territory. It had seemed like an adventure then, a chance to build something together from nothing. Now, standing in the mud beside the Missouri River with her small bundle of possessions at her feet, Sarah realized how naive she had been. The journey had revealed Thomas's true nature bit by bit. His impatience when she struggled to keep up during the long days of walking. His anger when she fell ill with fever for 3 days near Fort Kearny. His embarrassment when other men in their party noticed how often she stumbled or needed help with tasks that seemed to come naturally to the other pioneer women. "What about my things?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the wagon that held everything she owned in the world. Her grandmother's quilt, her mother's Bible, the few dresses she had sewn for her new life in Oregon. Thomas finally looked at her then, and Sarah was shocked by the coldness in his blue eyes. This was not the same man who had courted her with wildflowers and promises of a home with a white picket fence. "I'll leave you the small satchel with your personal items. The rest stays with me. I paid for those supplies, and I'll need them where I'm going." The other members of their wagon train avoided looking in Sarah's direction as they prepared to continue westward. Mrs. Henderson, who had seemed so kind during the early weeks of their journey, busied herself with packing her cooking pots. The Johnson family, with their 3 small children, had their backs turned as they loaded water barrels. Even the Reverend Phillips, who had married Sarah and Thomas in a roadside ceremony just outside Independence, found reasons to tend to his oxen rather than intervene. Sarah had tried to be a good wife. She had cooked Thomas's meals over countless campfires, washed his clothes in muddy streams, and endured his criticism without complaint. When the other women gathered to share gossip and remedies for the hardships of trail life, Sarah had felt like an outsider, too young and inexperienced to contribute much to their conversations. But she had listened and learned, trying to become the frontier woman Thomas expected her to be. The final straw had come 3 days earlier when Sarah had lost her footing while crossing a shallow creek. She had fallen hard, twisting her ankle and soaking their small bag of flour in the process. Thomas had erupted in fury, his voice carrying across the water as he berated her for her clumsiness. The flour was precious, he had shouted, and her carelessness could mean the difference between eating and starving before they reached their destination. That night, Sarah had heard Thomas talking quietly with some of the other men around their campfire. She couldn't make out all the words, but she heard enough to understand that they were discussing what to do about her. Someone mentioned that unmarried women sometimes stayed at trading posts until they could find work or passage back east. Another voice suggested that perhaps Sarah wasn't suited for the rigors of frontier life. Now, as the reality of abandonment settled over her like a heavy blanket, Sarah found herself fighting back tears. She would not give Thomas the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Not here, in front of everyone who had already written her off as too weak to survive in their new world. The trading post owner said they sometimes need help with cooking and cleaning, Thomas said, his voice taking on a tone of forced reasonableness. "You could work for room and board until you figure out what to do next. Maybe catch a riverboat back to civilization." Civilization. The word stung because Sarah knew what Thomas really meant. She belonged back in the safe, comfortable world they had left behind, not out here where survival depended on strength and stubbornness and the ability to endure hardship without complaint. In his mind, she was a delicate flower who had wilted under the harsh sun of the frontier. The wagon train was preparing to move out. Oxen lowed, and harnesses jangled as families made their final preparations. Sarah watched the children she had grown fond of during the long weeks of travel climbing into their family's wagons. Little Mary Johnson, who was barely 5, peeked around the canvas covering and waved shyly. Sarah waved back, her heart breaking a little more with each small gesture of farewell. Thomas climbed onto the wagon seat without looking back at her. The oxen strained against their yokes as the heavy wagon began to roll forward. One by one, the other families followed, their wagons creaking and swaying as they headed toward the setting sun. Sarah stood perfectly still, watching the dust cloud grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely beyond a rise in the prairie. The silence that followed was profound. For months, Sarah had grown accustomed to the constant noise of the wagon train, the sound of wheels on rocky ground, the voices of children playing, the lowing of cattle, the creak of leather and wood. Now there was only the whisper of wind through the tall grass and the distant murmur of the Missouri River. Jacob Hornsby, the trading post owner, approached her cautiously. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be easily shocked. "Well, young lady, looks like you're in a bit of a predicament." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She picked up her small satchel, surprised by how light it felt. Everything she owned in the world could now be carried in one hand. "My wife passed 3 years ago," Hornsby continued, his voice gentle. "I've been managing on my own, but I could use help with the cooking and cleaning. The pay isn't much, but you'd have a roof over your head and 3 meals a day. It's honest work." "Thank you," Sarah managed to say. "I'd be grateful for the opportunity." Hornsby's trading post consisted of a main building that served as both store and living quarters, a smaller cabin for hired help, and several outbuildings for storage and livestock. The main building was constructed of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, with a stone chimney that promised warmth during the harsh prairie winters. A wide porch faced the river, where travelers could rest in the shade while conducting their business. The interior of the trading post was dim and cluttered with the necessities of frontier life. Bolts of calico fabric, sacks of flour and beans, barrels of salt pork, tools, ammunition, and countless other items that wagon trains might need to replace or repair. The smell of leather, tobacco, and wood smoke created an atmosphere that was both welcoming and foreign to Sarah's senses. "You can stay in the back room for now," Hornsby said, leading her through the maze of merchandise. "It's not much, but it's private and dry. We'll work out the details of your employment tomorrow, once you've had a chance to rest." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin. A single window looked out toward the river, where the evening light was beginning to fade into purple twilight. Sarah set her satchel on the chair and sat heavily on the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her abandonment. For the first time since Thomas had announced his decision that morning, Sarah let the tears come. They fell silently at first, then with increasing force until her shoulders shook with the violence of her sobbing. She cried for the dreams that had died with her marriage, for the loneliness that stretched ahead of her like an endless prairie, and for the frightening uncertainty of her future in this wild place. Outside her window, the Missouri River continued its ancient journey toward the sea, indifferent to human suffering. Somewhere downstream, it would meet other rivers, growing stronger and wider until it joined the mighty Mississippi. Sarah envied the water, its certainty of purpose, its knowledge of where it was going and why. As full darkness settled over the prairie, Sarah heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the trading post. Voices called out in greeting, and she recognized the accent of French fur trappers who frequently stopped at such outposts to trade pelts and resupply before heading back into the wilderness. Their laughter drifted through her window, a reminder that life continued around her despite her personal tragedy. She heard Hornsby greeting the visitors, offering them coffee and a place to rest their horses. The normal sounds of hospitality and commerce went on as they always had, as they always would. Sarah was just another piece of human wreckage washed up on the shores of the frontier, no different from the abandoned wagons and unmarked graves that dotted the trail westward. The next morning brought new challenges. Sarah woke before dawn, determined to prove her worth to Hornsby and perhaps to herself. She had never been one to feel sorry for herself for long, and the frontier was no place for self-pity. If Thomas thought her too weak to survive out here, she would prove him wrong. She found Hornsby already awake, tending to the fire in the main room's large stone fireplace. Coffee was brewing in a blackened pot, and the smell helped drive away the last remnants of her tearful night. "Morning," Hornsby said without looking up from his work. "Hope you slept well enough. We've got traders coming through today, and the work starts early." Sarah rolled up her sleeves and set to work. She swept the main room, organized merchandise that had been displaced by the previous day's customers, and prepared breakfast for Hornsby and herself. The work was familiar enough, similar to the household tasks she had performed as a wife, but there was something different about working for wages rather than obligation. As the morning progressed, several groups of travelers stopped at the trading post. A family heading back east after losing their nerve somewhere near Fort Laramie. A group of mountain men whose beards and buckskin clothes marked them as men who lived by their own rules. A young couple, not much older than Sarah herself, who reminded her painfully of what she and Thomas had looked like when they started their journey, full of hope and determination. With each group of customers, Sarah found herself studying the relationships between husbands and wives, looking for clues about what made some marriages survive the trials of frontier life, while others, like her own, crumbled under pressure. The couple heading east held hands while making their purchases, supporting each other in their decision to admit defeat. The mountain men traveled without women, as if they had learned that love and wilderness survival were incompatible pursuits. During a quiet moment in the afternoon, Hornsby approached her as she mended a tear in one of his shirts. "You're doing good work," he said. "I can see why your husband thought you'd be useful around a place like this." Sarah looked up sharply, wondering if Hornsby meant to be cruel. But his expression was genuinely puzzled, not malicious. "He didn't think I was useful," Sarah said quietly. "That's why he left me here." Hornsby frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Any fool can see you've got sense and aren't afraid of hard work." What was his complaint exactly? Sarah found herself telling Hornsby about the flower incident, about Thomas's frustration with her lack of frontier skills, about the way the other families in their wagon train had seemed to agree that she was a burden rather than an asset. As she spoke, she realized how small and petty Thomas's grievances sounded when spoken aloud. "Sounds to me like you're better off without him," Hornsby said bluntly. "A man who'd abandon his wife over a bag of flour isn't much of a man at all. You'll find your way just fine without him dragging you down." That evening, as Sarah prepared supper for herself and Hornsby, she found herself thinking about the trading post owner's words. For the first time since her abandonment, she allowed herself to consider that maybe Thomas leaving her wasn't entirely a tragedy. Maybe it was an opportunity to discover who she really was when she wasn't trying to live up to someone else's expectations. The thought was both terrifying and oddly liberating. Sarah had never been alone before, had never had to depend entirely on her own judgment and abilities. She had gone from her parents' house to marriage without ever learning who she might be as an independent person. Now, whether she liked it or not, she was about to find out. As the sun set over the Missouri River, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Sarah stood on the trading post porch and watched the water flow past. Somewhere upstream, Thomas and the wagon train were making camp for the night, continuing their journey toward Oregon without her. Somewhere downstream, the great river carried all sorts of debris toward the sea. Fallen trees, abandoned possessions, the dreams and hopes of people who had tried and failed to make new lives in this unforgiving land. But the river also carried seeds, Sarah realized, watching a piece of driftwood spin lazily in the current. Seeds that would wash up on distant shores and take root in new soil, growing into something unexpected and strong. Maybe that's what she was now. Not abandoned debris, but a seed waiting to discover where the current would take her and what she might become when she finally found the right place to grow. 3 weeks passed at the trading post, and Sarah began to find a rhythm in her new life. Each morning, she rose before dawn to prepare breakfast and tend to the needs of travelers who had stopped for the night. Each evening, she swept the floors, counted inventory, and helped Hornsby balance his ledger books. The work was steady and honest, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt useful rather than burdensome. The frontier had its own harsh beauty that slowly revealed itself to her. Sunrises over the prairie painted the sky in colors she had never seen in Ohio. The night sounds of coyotes and owls created a wild symphony that initially frightened her, but gradually became as comforting as a lullaby. The Missouri River itself seemed to change personality with the weather, sometimes flowing peacefully between its banks, other times raging with spring runoff that turned the water brown with mud and debris. Sarah learned to read the signs that told her what kind of day it would be. When a wind came from the north, it brought the promise of rain and cooler temperatures that would make travelers grateful for hot coffee and a warm meal. When it came from the south, it carried the scent of distant prairie fires and the restless energy that made both animals and people nervous. Hornsby taught her to watch the behavior of birds and insects, which could predict weather changes hours before they became obvious to human senses. The variety of people who stopped at the trading post amazed Sarah. She met fur trappers whose French accents reminded her of fairy tales, their eyes holding secrets of wilderness places most people would never see. German immigrants passed through with their large families and patient oxen, speaking in musical voices about the farmland they hoped to claim in Kansas territory. Soldiers from Fort Leavenworth occasionally stopped for supplies, their blue uniforms and military bearing a reminder that this wild country was slowly being shaped by American expansion. Each group brought news from the outside world. A family heading east told stories of cholera outbreaks that had devastated several wagon trains. Mountain men shared rumors of gold discoveries in Colorado territory that were drawing prospectors away from the California fields. Soldiers spoke carefully about tensions with various Indian tribes, though they seemed reluctant to discuss details in front of civilians. Sarah absorbed these stories like a plant absorbs water, hungry for information about the wider world that had suddenly become her entire universe. In Ohio, news had come through newspapers and letters from relatives. Here, knowledge traveled by word of mouth, carried by people who had seen events firsthand or heard them from other travelers just a day or two behind them on the trail. One afternoon in early May, Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind a trading post when she heard unusual sound from the direction of the river. Instead of the normal rumble of flowing water, there was a new noise, a deep, rhythmic grinding that seemed to shake the ground beneath her feet. She dropped the shirt she was hanging and ran toward the riverbank to investigate. What she saw made her heart race with fear. The normally placid Missouri had become a raging torrent, swollen far beyond its usual banks by spring rains and snowmelt from the distant mountains. But worse than the high water was what the river was carrying. Enormous chunks of ice, some as large as buildings, grinding against each other with tremendous force as they swept downstream. "Ice jam!" Hornsby shouted from behind her, his voice tight with concern. "Must have broken loose upstream somewhere. This could be bad." Sarah had heard about ice jams, but had never seen one. During the winter, ice formed on the river's surface, sometimes growing thick enough to support the weight of men and horses. When spring brought warmer temperatures, this ice would break up and flow downstream in a process that was usually gradual and relatively harmless. But sometimes, especially after a particularly cold winter followed by a sudden warm spell, huge sections of ice would break loose all at once, creating a destructive flood of water and ice that could destroy anything in its path. As Sarah and Hornsby watched, the leading edge of the ice jam rounded the bend upstream from the trading post. The sound was deafening now, like 1,000 wooden wagons rolling over rocky ground. Ice chunks collided with tremendous crashes, throwing spray high into the air and creating temporary dams that caused the water level to rise even higher. "We need to get everything valuable up to higher ground," Hornsby said, already turning back toward the trading post. "And we need to do it fast." They worked frantically for the next hour, moving merchandise and supplies from the main building to a small storage shed that sat on slightly higher ground about 50 yards from the river. Sarah's arms ached from carrying heavy sacks of flour and beans, but she didn't slow down. She had seen the power of the rushing water and ice, and she understood that everything they couldn't move to safety would likely be destroyed. Other travelers had been caught by the ice jam as well. A small wagon train that had been preparing to cross the river at the ford near the trading post was stranded on the opposite bank, their way blocked by the dangerous ice flow. Sarah could see them across the water, tiny figures gesturing helplessly as they watched the crossing become impossible. "How long will it last?" Sarah asked as she and Hornsby paused for a moment to catch their breath. "Could be hours, could be days," Hornsby replied grimly. "Depends on how much ice is coming down from upstream and whether it gets hung up on any obstacles. Last time I saw one this bad was about 5 years ago. Took 3 days for the river to clear." As if summoned by his words, a particularly large chunk of ice struck a dead tree that had fallen partway across the river. The impact was so violent that Sarah felt it through the soles of her feet. The tree splintered and disappeared beneath the churning water, but not before causing several other ice chunks to pile up behind it, creating a temporary dam that made the water level rise even higher. The Missouri was now flowing well above its normal banks, approaching the level of the trading post itself. Water lapped at the edges of the wooden platform that served as a loading dock for riverboats. The outhouse, which had been built close to the riverbank for obvious practical reasons, was now completely surrounded by brown, swirling water. "Sarah, look!" Hornsby pointed upstream toward a bend in the river where something was moving against the flow of ice and water. "Someone's in trouble." Squinting through the spray and confusion, Sarah could make out what appeared to be a makeshift raft being swept toward them by the current. On it, barely visible through the mist, was a human figure clinging desperately to what looked like logs lashed together with rope. "We have to help them," Sarah said, already moving toward the riverbank. "Too dangerous," Hornsby replied, catching her arm. "That raft is going to be swept past us in seconds, and anyone who gets in that water won't come out alive." But even as he spoke, the raft struck something beneath the surface and spun sideways, slowing its downstream progress. For a moment, it looked as if it might wash up against the trading post's landing, giving them a chance to attempt a rescue. Sarah broke free from Hornsby's grasp and ran toward the dock, grabbing a coil of rope from a pile of supplies they had been moving to higher ground. Without pausing to think about the danger, she tied one end of the rope around her waist and the other end to a solid post that supported the dock's roof. "Sarah, don't be a fool," Hornsby called after her, but she was already wading into the shallow water at the edge of the dock. The current was stronger than she had expected, and the water was shockingly cold. Ice chunks bumped against her legs as she struggled to maintain her footing on the muddy bottom. But the raft was drifting closer now, and she could see that the person clinging to it was a young woman, possibly even younger than Sarah herself. "Here," Sarah called, extending the rope toward the raft. "Grab hold." The woman on the raft looked up with desperate eyes and reached towards Sarah's outstretched hand. For a moment, their fingers touched, and Sarah thought she had her. Then, another surge of current caught the raft and spun it away, pulling the woman beyond Sarah's reach. Sarah waded deeper into the water, following the raft as it continued to drift downstream. The rope around her waist grew taut, and she felt Hornsby pulling her back towards safety. But she couldn't give up, not when someone's life hung in the balance. "Please," the woman on the raft called out, her voice barely audible above the roar of the ice jam. "My baby." "Baby?" Sarah looked more carefully and realized that the woman was holding something against her chest, something small and precious that she was protecting with her own body. The sight filled Sarah with a fierce determination that overcame her fear. She untied the rope from around her waist and handed the end to Hornsby, who had waded into the water behind her. "Give me more slack," she said. "I'm going to try to get closer to the bank downstream and intercept them there." "Sarah, this is madness," Hornsby protested, but he played out more rope as Sarah half swam, half stumbled through the flood water toward a point where the current might bring the raft within reach. The water was now up to Sarah's chest, and she could feel the tremendous force of the current trying to sweep her downstream along with the ice and debris. Her feet slipped on the muddy bottom, and for a terrifying moment, she went completely underwater, the rope around her waist the only thing preventing her from being carried away by the flood. When she surfaced, gasping and choking, the raft was almost upon her. The woman's eyes were wide with desperation and something else that Sarah recognized as the fierce protectiveness of motherhood. Without thinking, Sarah lunged forward and managed to grab one of the logs that formed the raft's edge. The impact nearly tore her arms from their sockets as the raft's momentum transferred to the rope, which stretched taut between Sarah and the solid post on the dock. For several seconds, they hung suspended in the rushing water, the raft held against the current by Sarah's grip and Hornsby's strength on the other end of the rope. "Can you swim?" Sarah gasped to the woman on the raft. "A little," came the reply, "but I can't let go of my baby." Sarah looked at the bundle the woman held and realized it was indeed an infant, probably only a few months old. Swimming to safety while protecting a baby would be nearly impossible in these conditions. "We'll have to bring the raft in," Sarah called back to Hornsby. "She has a baby." What followed was the most exhausting physical effort of Sarah's life. Inch by inch, with Hornsby pulling on the rope and Sarah guiding the raft from the water, they managed to work their way back toward the landing dock. The current fought them every step of the way, and more than once Sarah thought her grip would fail, and they would lose both the raft and its precious cargo to the raging river. When they finally reached shallow water near the dock, Sarah was so exhausted she could barely stand. Hornsby waded out to help the woman and her baby onto solid ground while Sarah collapsed on the muddy bank, her lungs burning from the effort and her muscles trembling from cold and fatigue. The woman they had rescued was indeed young, probably no more than 17 or 18. Her clothes were soaked through, and she shivered uncontrollably as she clutched her baby to her chest. The infant, miraculously, appeared to be unharmed, though clearly frightened by the ordeal. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I thought we were going to die." "You're safe now," Sarah managed to say between gasps for breath. "Let's get you inside where it's warm and dry." As they helped the woman and her baby toward the trading post, Sarah caught sight of the raft they had abandoned at the water's edge. It was a crude construction, clearly built in haste from whatever materials had been available. Lashed to one of the logs was a small bundle of possessions wrapped in oilcloth, suggesting that this woman had been traveling with everything she owned in the world. Inside the trading post, Hornsby built up the fire while Sarah found dry clothes and blankets for their unexpected guest. The woman accepted their help gratefully, but seemed reluctant to talk about how she had ended up alone on a raft in the middle of a dangerous ice jam. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," Sarah said gently, as she helped the woman change into dry clothes. "This is Jacob Hornsby's trading post. You're safe here." "I'm Martha," the woman replied quietly. "Martha Crow Dog. And this is my daughter, Little Bird." She looked down at the baby in her arms with an expression of such fierce love that Sarah felt her heart contract with sympathy. The name suggested that Martha was of mixed heritage, possibly part Indian, though her features were ambiguous enough that Sarah couldn't be certain. In this part of the frontier, such mixing was not uncommon, though it often led to complications that made life difficult for the children of such unions. As the evening wore on and Martha regained her strength, she gradually told her story. She was the daughter of a French fur trapper and a Lakota woman, raised in her mother's village until her father's death 2 years earlier. After that, life in the Indian camp had become difficult for her and her mixed-blood daughter. Some members of the tribe viewed them with suspicion, seeing their European features as a reminder of the encroaching white settlement that threatened traditional ways of life. When Martha's Lakota husband had been killed in a hunting accident the previous winter, her position in the village had become impossible. With no male relative to protect her and a baby to care for, she had faced the choice of accepting an unwanted marriage to a much older man or leaving the tribe to make her own way in the world. "I thought I could reach St. Louis," Martha explained, nursing her baby by the light of the fire. "I heard there were people there who would help women in my situation, but the ice jam caught me by surprise. I had been following the river for 3 days, staying close to the water because it was easier to travel along the bank than through the thick brush inland." Sarah listened to Martha's story with growing sympathy and recognition. Here was another woman who had been abandoned by circumstances beyond her control, another person trying to survive in a world that seemed designed to crush the vulnerable. The difference was that Martha had a baby to protect, which made her situation infinitely more desperate than Sarah's own. "You can stay here as long as you need to," Sarah said impulsively, then looked at Hornsby for confirmation. "Can't she, Mr. Hornsby?" Hornsby nodded slowly. "For a while at least, until you figure out what you want to do next. But I should warn you, Martha, that this part of the country isn't always safe for someone of your background. There are people who might cause you trouble." Martha's expression hardened slightly. "I've dealt with that kind of trouble before. My mother taught me that you can't let other people's ignorance determine how you live your life. As the three of them sat by the fire, listening to the ice jam continue its destructive passage downstream, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. A month ago, she had been a married woman heading west with dreams of building a farm in Oregon. Now she was working at a frontier trading post and helping to care for a mixed-blood mother and her infant daughter. The changes frightened her, but they also filled her with a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she was making decisions based on what felt right to her rather than what others expected of her. When she had seen Martha in danger on the river, she hadn't stopped to consider whether it was proper or safe for a respectable woman to wade into floodwaters. She had simply acted according to her conscience. Outside, the ice jam was finally beginning to break up and move on downstream. The terrible grinding noise was fading, replaced by the more normal sound of flowing water. By morning, Sarah knew the Missouri would likely be back within its banks, leaving behind the usual debris of flood and destruction, but also the promise of renewal that came with each season's cycle of destruction and rebirth. As she prepared a bed for Martha and her baby in the small back room that had been her own refuge, Sarah realized that her life was following a similar pattern. The old Sarah, the woman who had been Thomas Mitchell's inadequate wife, had been swept away by forces beyond her control. What remained was someone new, someone who was still discovering her own strength and capacity for independence. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since her abandonment, Sarah felt a sense of anticipation rather than dread when she thought about what tomorrow might bring. She had saved a life today, had acted with courage and decisiveness when the moment demanded it. If she could do that, perhaps she could handle whatever other challenges the frontier might throw at her. Summer arrived early that year, bringing with it a steady stream of travelers and the constant work of serving the needs of pioneers heading west. Martha proved to be an invaluable addition to the trading post's small household. Her knowledge of local plants and their medicinal uses impressed even Hornsby, who had thought himself well-versed in frontier survival. She could identify edible roots and berries that grew wild around the trading post, prepare remedies for common ailments that plagued travelers, and preserve food in ways that Sarah had never imagined. Most importantly, Martha brought a perspective on frontier life that neither Sarah nor Hornsby possessed. Having lived between two worlds, she understood both the Indian and white approaches to survival in the wilderness. When a group of Pawnee warriors stopped at the trading post in June, it was Martha who served as translator and negotiator, helping Hornsby trade fairly with them while avoiding the kind of misunderstandings that could turn dangerous. The Pawnee are good people, Martha explained to Sarah after the warriors had departed with their purchases of coffee, sugar, and metal tools. But they're under pressure from all sides. White settlers are taking their hunting grounds, and other tribes are being pushed westward by the government. Everyone is fighting for the same resources. Sarah watched Martha nurse her baby in the shade of the trading post's porch and marveled at the young woman's resilience. Little Bird was thriving under her mother's care, growing plump and cheerful despite the uncertainties of their situation. Martha had fashioned a cradleboard in the traditional Indian style, allowing her to carry her daughter while working, and the baby seemed content to observe the world from this secure vantage point. The relationship between Sarah and Martha had deepened into genuine friendship over the weeks since the rescue. Despite their different backgrounds, they shared the common experience of abandonment and the need to create new lives from the wreckage of old dreams. Martha's practical knowledge complemented Sarah's education, while Sarah's literacy skills helped Martha understand the changing legal and political landscape that affected all frontier residents. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit on the porch while Martha told stories of her childhood in the Lakota village. Sarah learned about the seasonal migrations that followed the buffalo herds, the complex social relationships that governed tribal life, and the spiritual beliefs that connected all living things in an intricate web of meaning. In return, Sarah shared her own memories of Ohio, the books she had read, and the dreams she had carried westward before Thomas's abandonment. Hornsby watched this friendship develop with approval and, Sarah suspected, a certain amount of relief. The presence of two competent women had transformed his struggling trading post into a more welcoming and profitable establishment. Martha's ability to communicate with Indian customers had opened new trading relationships, while Sarah's organizational skills had brought order to his chaotic inventory and accounting systems. But The peaceful rhythm of summer life was disrupted in late July by the arrival of a military patrol from Fort Leavenworth. Captain James Morrison was a career soldier in his 40s, weathered by years of frontier service and possessed of the kind of rigid adherence to regulations that Sarah found both admirable and slightly frightening. He had come to investigate reports of unauthorized trading with hostile Indians and to ensure that civilian establishments like Hornsby's were complying with federal policies regarding commerce with native tribes. I'll need to see your trading licenses and records of all transactions with Indian customers, Morrison announced after introducing himself and his small detachment of soldiers. His eyes swept over the trading post's interior, taking note of every detail with military precision. Hornsby produced the required documents, but Sarah could see tension in his shoulders as the captain reviewed them. Federal regulations regarding Indian trade were complex and frequently changed, making it difficult for frontier traders to remain in full compliance. Moreover, the political situation had grown increasingly volatile as more white settlers moved into territory that Indian tribes considered their ancestral homeland. "This is Martha Crow Dog," Hornsby said when Morrison's gaze settled on the young woman who was preparing coffee for the unexpected guests. "She's been helping with translation services when Indian customers visit the post." Morrison's expression hardened slightly at the mention of Martha's obviously mixed heritage name. "Is she registered with the Indian Agency?" All persons of mixed blood engaged in commerce between white and Indian populations are required to be documented. "She's not engaged in official commerce," Sarah interjected before Hornsby could respond. "She's an employee of the trading post, just like I am." The captain turned his attention to Sarah for the first time, his gray eyes assessing her with the same thoroughness he had applied to Hornsby's inventory. "And you are?" "Sarah Mitchell. I work here as well." Morrison consulted a leather-bound notebook he carried in his jacket pocket. "Mitchell, would that be connected to the Thomas Mitchell who filed a complaint about Indian harassment near the Platte River crossing last month?" Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "Thomas Mitchell is my husband," she said carefully, not mentioning their current separated status. According to his report, a group of Cheyenne warriors demanded tribute for passage through what they claimed was their territory. Mitchell stated that his wife was threatened during the encounter. Morrison's tone was neutral, but Sarah sensed that he was fishing for information that might support some larger military agenda. "I wasn't threatened," Sarah said firmly. "The Cheyenne were asking for a fair trade, not demanding tribute. They offered to guide our wagon train safely through their territory in exchange for some supplies we could easily spare. My husband chose to interpret their offer as a threat." Morrison made a note in his book. That's not how he described it in his official complaint. He specifically mentioned that Indian warriors made menacing gestures toward you and suggested that white women were not safe in that area without military protection. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. Even in abandoning her, Thomas had managed to cause her new problems. His complaint to the military, probably motivated more by his general resentment toward frontier hardships than by any specific incident, was now being used to justify increased military supervision of civilian Indian interactions. "My husband tends to exaggerate," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. "I was never in any real danger from the Cheyenne. If anything, they were more courteous than many white travelers I've encountered." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly at this statement. That's an unusual perspective for a frontier woman. Most females in your situation are grateful for military protection from Indian threats. "Maybe most women haven't had the opportunity to interact with Indians as people rather than as threats," Sarah replied, her voice growing sharper despite her efforts to remain diplomatic. The captain closed his notebook with a snap. "I'll need to speak with Miss Crow Dog privately about her trading activities. Military regulations require us to document all persons of mixed heritage who might serve as intermediaries between white and Indian populations." Martha, who had been listening to this conversation while preparing refreshments for the soldiers, set down the coffee pot and faced Morrison directly. "What do you want to know?" "Your tribal affiliations, your family connections within Indian populations, and the nature of your communications with tribal representatives who visit this trading post." Morrison's tone was brisk and businesslike, as if he were conducting a routine inventory rather than questioning a young mother about her personal life. Martha lifted her chin slightly, a gesture that Sarah had learned indicated she was preparing to defend herself. "My mother was Lakota. My father was French. I was raised in my mother's village until her death 2 years ago. Since then, I've been on my own with my daughter. And your current living arrangements? I work here in exchange for room and board. Same as Sarah. Morrison made more notes. Have you encouraged Indian customers to trade here rather than at authorized military posts? I've translated when necessary to prevent misunderstandings. Nothing more. Sarah watched this exchange with growing unease. She could see that Morrison was building a case for something, though she wasn't certain what. The military's relationship with civilian traders was always complex, involving questions of jurisdiction, economic competition, and political control that went far beyond simple law enforcement. Captain Hornsby interjected, I've been operating this trading post legally for 8 years. I pay my licensing fees, follow federal regulations, and maintain good relationships with all my customers, Indian and white alike. Miss Crow Dog has done nothing but help me serve customers better. Morrison finished his notes and returned the book to his pocket. I'm not questioning your compliance, Mr. Hornsby, but the political situation is becoming more delicate. There are reports of increased Indian resistance to white settlement in this region. Some tribal leaders are talking about forming alliances to oppose further expansion. Under these circumstances, we need to be especially careful about unauthorized communications between white establishments and potentially hostile Indian groups. The Indians who trade here aren't hostile, Martha said quietly. Their families trying to survive in a world that's changing faster than they can adapt to it. They trade for coffee and sugar and metal tools because these things make their lives easier, not because they're planning to attack white settlements. Morrison studied Martha with the expression of a man trying to solve a complicated puzzle. You seem to have considerable sympathy for the Indian perspective. I am Indian, Martha replied simply. I'm also white. I understand both sides because I belong to both sides. That kind of divided loyalty is exactly what concerns military authorities, Morrison said. In times of tension, people with connections to both communities can become conduits for information that might be used against American interests. Sarah felt her temper flare at the captain's implication. Martha has done nothing but help travelers of all backgrounds. She saved lives with her medical knowledge and prevented conflicts with her translation skills. If you're looking for threats to American interests, you should be questioning the kind of men who abandon their wives on the frontier, not women who risk their own lives to help others. The reference to her own abandonment was subtle, but Sarah saw understanding flicker in Morrison's eyes. He was an experienced enough officer to read between the lines and recognize that Sarah's situation was more complicated than her initial identification as Thomas Mitchell's wife had suggested. Mrs. Mitchell, Morrison said, his tone softening slightly. I understand that frontier life creates unusual circumstances for all concerned. My job is simply to assess potential security risks and ensure that civilian establishments are operating within federal guidelines. I'm not here to cause problems for honest people trying to make a living. Then, why does it feel like you're trying to find reasons to cause problems for Martha? Sarah asked directly. Morrison was quiet for a moment, studying the faces of the 3 people who represented the civilian population he was supposed to protect. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of honest frustration. Because my superiors in Washington believe that the Indian problem can be solved through military force and strict control of civilian Indian interactions. They see people like Miss Crow Dog as potential security threats rather than as resources who might help prevent conflicts through better communication and understanding. And what do you believe? Martha asked. Morrison glanced toward his soldiers, who were watering their horses at the river, then back toward the small group gathered on the trading post porch. I believe that most conflicts on the frontier result from misunderstanding and fear rather than genuine hostility. I also believe that people like you, who understand both cultures, are probably our best hope for preventing unnecessary violence. Then, why are you investigating us like criminals? Sarah asked. Because I have orders to investigate, and because I need to be able to report back that I've done my job thoroughly. Morrison's voice carried the weariness of a man caught between conflicting loyalties. But I also need to be able to report accurately on what I find, not what my superiors expect me to find. Hornsby offered Morrison and his men accommodation for the night, which they accepted gratefully. As evening settled over the trading post, Sarah found herself watching the interactions between the soldiers and the civilian residents with new understanding. Morrison's men were young, most of them probably farm boys from back east who had enlisted seeking adventure, but found themselves enforcing policies they didn't fully understand in a land that constantly challenged their preconceptions. Around the evening fire, Martha shared stories of her childhood that painted a very different picture of Indian life than the one most of the soldiers had heard. She talked about the careful way her mother's people managed their relationship with the land, taking only what they needed and leaving the rest for future generations. She described the complex social structures that governed tribal decisions, the role of women in maintaining peace between competing interests, and the spiritual beliefs that connected individual welfare to the health of the entire community. Sounds almost civilized, one of the younger soldiers commented, earning sharp looks from his companions. It is civilized, Martha replied without defensiveness. It's just a different kind of civilization than the one you're used to. Sarah watched Morrison, taking mental notes of this conversation, recognizing that the captain was indeed trying to understand the complex reality of frontier life rather than simply confirming his pre-existing beliefs. When the soldiers retired to their bedrolls, Morrison lingered on the porch for a private conversation with Hornsby. I'll be reporting that your trading post operates within federal guidelines and poses no security threat to regional stability, Morrison said quietly. But I should warn you that pressure is building for stricter controls on civilian Indian commerce. Political leaders back east are convinced that the only solution to frontier tensions is complete separation of white and Indian populations. And you think that's possible? Hornsby asked. Morrison looked out toward the river, where moonlight created silver patterns on the flowing water. I think it's already too late for complete separation. There are too many people like Miss Crow Dog who bridge both worlds, too many white traders who depend on Indian customers, too many intermarried families whose very existence challenges the idea of racial separation. The politicians can make all the laws they want, but they can't change the reality that people are people regardless of their ancestry. What happens to people like Martha if the government decides to enforce complete separation? Sarah asked from the doorway, where she had been listening to the men's conversation. Morrison turned toward her, his expression grave. Honestly, I don't know. People of mixed heritage often get caught in the middle when political tensions increase. They're too Indian for white society and too white for Indian society. They become scapegoats that both sides blame for problems that have deeper causes. Sarah felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. She thought about Martha's baby, little Bird, who would grow up in a world that might refuse to accept her because of her mixed ancestry. She thought about the arbitrary nature of the classifications that determined who belonged where, who was considered civilized, and who was considered savage. There has to be another way, Sarah said quietly. Maybe there is, Morrison replied. But it would require people on both sides to be willing to see each other as human beings rather than as threats to be eliminated. From where I sit, that kind of understanding seems to be getting rarer rather than more common. As the captain prepared to join his men for the night, Sarah found herself thinking about the choices that lay ahead for all of them. Martha couldn't hide her heritage, and Little Bird would inherit both the advantages and disadvantages of her mixed ancestry. Sarah herself was discovering that life on the frontier required constant adaptation to circumstances that changed without warning. Tomorrow, Morrison and his soldiers would continue their patrol, carrying with them whatever impressions they had formed during their brief stay at the trading post. Their reports would become part of the official record that shaped government policy toward frontier settlements and their relationships with Indian populations. But tonight, as Sarah looked up at the vast expanse of stars that seemed to stretch forever above the prairie, she allowed herself to hope that understanding between different peoples was still possible. Martha and Little Bird represented the future, whether politicians wanted to acknowledge it or not. Their very existence proved that the boundaries between different worlds were more fluid than anyone wanted to admit. The Missouri River continued its eternal journey toward the sea, carrying with it the dreams and hopes of all the people whose lives intersected along its banks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, and new opportunities to either build bridges or tear them down. Sarah was beginning to understand that survival on the frontier required not just physical courage, but the moral courage to treat all people with dignity regardless of their ancestry or circumstances. Autumn came early to the Missouri River country that year, painting the cottonwoods along the riverbank in brilliant shades of gold and orange. The steady stream of westbound travelers had slowed to a trickle as families hurried to reach their destinations before winter weather made travel impossible. Sarah had learned to read the signs of approaching change, the way birds gathered in restless flocks, the sharp clarity of morning air that hinted at frost, and the urgency with which experienced travelers pushed forward without stopping for anything but essential supplies. Life at the trading post had settled into comfortable patterns. Martha's baby, little bird, was now old enough to sit up and observe the world with bright, curious eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Martha had woven her daughter a new cradle board decorated with traditional Lakota beadwork, a connection to her cultural heritage that she was determined to maintain despite their uncertain circumstances. Sarah found herself studying Martha's skillful hands as they worked the tiny glass beads into intricate patterns. The designs told stories. Martha explained, recording family history and spiritual beliefs in a visual language that could be read by those who understood its symbols. The blue beads represented the sky and water, connecting Little Bird to the vast forces that governed all life. The red beads symbolized the earth and blood, grounding her in the physical world she would need to navigate as she grew. My mother taught me that we carry our stories with us wherever we go, Martha said as she worked. Even if we lose everything else, the stories remain to tell us who we are. Sarah thought about her own stories as she watched Martha's careful stitching. What patterns would she create to represent her journey from Ohio farmer's daughter to abandoned wife to independent frontier woman? The narrative of her life had changed so dramatically in just a few months that she sometimes felt like she was reading about someone else's experiences. The comfortable routine of their shared work was disrupted one morning in late September when Sarah spotted a familiar figure walking along the river trail toward the trading post. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking Thomas Mitchell's tall frame and confident stride. Her first instinct was to run inside and hide, but something deeper than fear or anger kept her standing on the porch as her estranged husband approached. Thomas looked much as he had when he left her 3 months earlier, though his clothes were more worn and his face was weathered by constant exposure to sun and wind. His expression was unreadable as he stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at the woman he had abandoned. "Hello, Sarah." "Thomas." Sarah was surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. She had imagined this moment many times, but in her mental rehearsals she had either been devastated by his appearance or blazing with righteous anger. Instead, she felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching a play in which she had only a minor role. "You look well," Thomas said, his eyes taking in the changes that months of frontier work had made in her appearance. Sarah knew she was stronger now, her hands calloused from honest labor, and her posture more confident than when they had last seen each other. "I am well. The work here suits me." Thomas glanced toward the trading post door, where Martha had appeared with Little Bird in her arms. His eyes lingered on the baby's features, which clearly showed her mixed heritage, then moved to Martha's face with an expression that Sarah recognized as disapproval. "I heard you were working with Indians," Thomas said, his tone carrying the same judgmental quality that had made Sarah feel inadequate during their marriage. "I work with all kinds of people," Sarah replied evenly, "just like any business does." Hornsby emerged from the trading post, alerted by voices on the porch. He nodded politely to Thomas, but positioned himself slightly closer to Sarah, a gesture of support that she found both touching and reassuring. "Mitchell," Hornsby said, "didn't expect to see you back this way." "I came to talk to my wife," Thomas replied, his voice carrying an assumption of authority that no longer seemed to have any power over Sarah. "Then talk," Sarah said. "But if you've come to criticize my choices or the people I work with, you can save yourself the trouble and continue on your way to Oregon." Thomas looked genuinely surprised by her directness. During their marriage, Sarah had rarely challenged him so openly, preferring to avoid conflict even when she disagreed with his decisions. The woman standing before him now was clearly not the same person he had left behind. The Oregon venture didn't work out, Thomas admitted after a moment. "Found out too late that the land I'd been promised was already claimed by another family. Spent most of my remaining supplies on a legal battle that went nowhere." Sarah felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it was quickly overwhelmed by memories of how Thomas had blamed her for much smaller disappointments during their westward journey. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, "but I'm not sure what it has to do with me." "I came back to get you," Thomas said, as if the answer should have been obvious. "I was wrong to leave you here. A man should stand by his wife, regardless of circumstances." The words Sarah had once longed to hear now struck her as hollow and self-serving. She studied Thomas's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse or understanding, but saw only the familiar assumption that she would be grateful for his attention regardless of how poorly he had treated her. "You want me to come back because your plans failed and you need someone to take care of you," Sarah said. "Not because you've realized you were wrong to abandon me." "A wife's place is with her husband," Thomas replied, falling back on traditional arguments when emotional appeals failed to work. "What you're doing here isn't natural, Sarah. Working alongside Indians, living without proper supervision. It's not the life we planned together." Sarah glanced at Martha, who was listening to this conversation with careful attention. Little Bird had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, her tiny face peaceful despite the tension that filled the air around the adults. "The life we planned together ended when you decided I was too much trouble to keep," Sarah said. "I've built a new life here, one that I'm not willing to give up." Thomas's expression hardened, revealing the anger that had always lurked beneath his surface charm. "You're my wife, Sarah. Legally and morally, you belong to me. I have the right to demand that you fulfill your obligations." "Rights and obligations," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting that you should mention those. What about your obligation to protect and provide for me? What about my right to be treated with respect and consideration?" "I made a mistake," Thomas said, though his tone suggested that he was making this admission reluctantly. "I let frustration get the better of me. But that doesn't change the fundamental facts of our situation." Sarah looked at this man who had once represented everything she thought she wanted from life. He was still handsome, still possessed of the confidence that had initially attracted her. But now she could see the selfishness that had always been there, hidden beneath romantic gestures and promises of adventure. "The fundamental facts have changed," Sarah said quietly. "I'm not the same woman you left here, Thomas. I've learned that I can take care of myself, that I can make decisions and live with the consequences. I've discovered that I'm stronger than either of us realized." "This is ridiculous," Thomas said, his voice rising with frustration. "You're a woman alone on the frontier, working for a few dollars a month at some backwoods trading post. What kind of future does that offer? I'm giving you a chance to return to respectability, to the life you were meant to have." "Respectability," Sarah repeated. "Is that what you call a marriage where the husband abandons his wife whenever she becomes inconvenient?" Martha stepped forward, her presence a reminder that this conversation was taking place in front of witnesses. "Perhaps this discussion would be better held privately," she suggested diplomatically. "This doesn't concern you," Thomas snapped, his eyes flashing with an anger that made Sarah take a step backward. The tone of Thomas's voice, harsh and dismissive, triggered something protective in Sarah. She had seen too many travelers pass through the trading post treating Martha with casual disrespect because of her heritage, and she had no intention of allowing her own estranged husband to add to that burden. "Martha is my friend and my colleague," Sarah said firmly. "She has every right to be here, and you have no right to speak to her that way." "Friend?" Thomas's voice was incredulous. "Sarah, she's an Indian. You can't be friends with an Indian." The casual racism in Thomas's statement revealed everything Sarah needed to know about why their marriage had been doomed from the beginning. She had married a man who saw the world in rigid categories, who believed that some people were inherently superior to others based on accidents of birth and circumstance. "Martha is one of the finest people I've ever known," Sarah said. "She's intelligent, kind, hardworking, and brave. She's a better friend than most of the supposedly respectable women I knew back in Ohio." Thomas looked at Sarah as if she had announced that she believed the earth was flat. In his world, the notion that an Indian woman could possess admirable qualities was simply incomprehensible. "This place has poisoned your mind," Thomas said. "Living out here, working with these people, it's made you forget who you really are." "No, Sarah Blave. It's helped me remember who I really am. Or maybe it's helped me discover who I could become when I stopped trying to be what other people expected me to be." A group of riders appeared on the trail leading to the trading post, their approach marked by dust clouds and the sound of hoofbeats. Sarah recognized them as Pawnee warriors who had traded at the post several times during the summer. Their arrival created a new dynamic to the confrontation, as Thomas instinctively moved closer to Sarah in response to what he perceived as a potential threat. "Get inside," Thomas ordered, his hand moving toward the pistol he carried on his belt. "They're customers," Sarah said firmly, "and they're welcome here." The Pawnee riders dismounted and approached the trading post with the casual confidence of people who knew they would be received courteously. Their leader, a man named Running Wolf whom Sarah had met several times, nodded politely to the assembled group on the porch. Martha stepped forward and greeted the warriors in their own language, a skill that never failed to impress Sarah with its demonstration of a young woman's adaptability and intelligence. The conversation was brief but friendly, concluding with Running Wolf's request to purchase coffee and ammunition for his hunting party. As Hornsby went inside to prepare the requested items, Sarah found herself watching Thomas's reaction to this everyday interaction. His hand remained near his weapon, his posture tense with suspicion and fear. He clearly saw the Pawnee warriors as dangerous savages rather than as human beings engaged in peaceful commerce. "You see," Thomas said quietly to Sarah while the transaction was taking place, "this is no place for a white woman. You're surrounded by hostiles who could turn violent at any moment." Sarah looked at the Pawnee warriors, who were patiently waiting for their purchases while Little Bird slept peacefully in her mother's arms. She thought about the many times these same men had brought news of the trail ahead, warned travelers about dangerous river crossings, and even helped search for lost livestock. Their presence had always made the trading post feel safer rather than more dangerous. "The only hostility I see here is coming from you," Sarah told Thomas. The Pawnee warriors completed their business and prepared to continue their journey. Running Wolf paused to speak briefly with Martha, then nodded respectfully to Sarah before mounting his horse. The entire interaction had been conducted with a courtesy and dignity that compared favorably to many exchanges with white customers. After the warriors disappeared down the trail, Thomas turned back to Sarah with renewed determination. "I'm not leaving without you," he declared. "I've come too far and given up too much to go back empty-handed." "Then, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed," Sarah replied. "I won't be going anywhere with you, Thomas. Our marriage ended the day you decided I was disposable." Thomas's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Sarah could see him struggling with emotions he didn't know how to express, trapped between his desire to reclaim what he considered his property and his recognition that the woman before him was no longer the malleable girl he had married. "You'll regret this decision," Thomas said finally. "Winter's coming, and this place won't seem so appealing when you're trapped here for months with no company but savages and misfits." "I'll take my chances," Sarah said. "I'd rather spend the winter with people who treat me with respect than with a man who sees me as a burden to be carried or discarded based on his convenience." Thomas looked around the trading post one more time, his expression suggesting that he was memorizing details for some future purpose. When his gaze settled on Martha and her baby, his face hardened with an emotion that Sarah found disturbing. "This isn't over," Thomas said as he prepared to leave. "There are laws about abandoned wives, Sarah, and there are laws about whites living with Indians in ways that might encourage hostility against American interests." The threat was clear, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Thomas might not be able to force her to return to their marriage, but he could potentially cause legal problems for Martha and even for Hornsby's trading post. His mention of laws regarding white Indian relationships suggested that he had been thinking carefully about ways to use the system against people he saw as obstacles to getting what he wanted. "Get off my property," Hornsby said quietly, emerging from the trading post with a rifle in his hands. "And don't come back unless you're prepared to conduct yourself like a civilized man." Thomas looked as if he might argue, but the sight of Hornsby's weapon and the determined expressions on the faces of the people he was trying to intimidate apparently convinced him that retreat was the better part of valor. "This isn't finished," Thomas said as he walked away toward his horse, which he had left tied to a post near the river. "I'll be back with proper authorities to settle this matter." As Thomas mounted his horse and rode away, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had stood up to him successfully, but his parting threat suggested that the confrontation had created new dangers rather than resolving old problems. "Do you think he meant what he said about bringing authorities?" Martha asked quietly. Sarah watched Thomas's figure grow smaller in the distance, noting the rigid set of his shoulders that indicated his anger was far from spent. "I think Thomas is capable of causing trouble for anyone he sees as responsible for his disappointment. We need to be prepared for whatever he might do." But even as she spoke, Sarah realized that her primary emotion was not fear but determination. She had chosen her path, and she would deal with whatever consequences that choice might bring. For the first time in her life, She was living according to her own values rather than someone else's expectations, and that sense of authenticity was worth whatever risks it might entail. Winter descended upon the Missouri River country with a ferocity that tested the resolve of even the most experienced frontier dwellers. The first snow fell in late October, followed by a series of storms that left the trading post isolated for weeks at a time. Sarah learned to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes. The way the wind shifted from south to north, the restless behavior of birds before a storm, and the ache in her joints that seemed to forecast temperature drops with uncanny accuracy. The work of survival became all-consuming. Firewood had to be cut and split daily to keep the buildings warm. Food stores required careful management to ensure supplies lasted through months when fresh provisions would be impossible to obtain. Water had to be hauled from the river even when ice formed along the banks, making the task dangerous as well as laborious. But Sarah discovered that winter brought unexpected compensations along with its hardships. The enforced isolation created an intimacy between the trading post residents that would have been impossible during the busy summer months. Evening conversations by the fire revealed depths of character and experience that had only been hinted at during busier times. Martha shared stories of her mother's people that painted vivid pictures of a world where spiritual and practical concerns were seamlessly integrated. She spoke of winter ceremonies that honored the endurance of all living things during the harsh months when survival required both physical strength and mental resilience. These stories helped Sarah understand that her own struggles were part of a larger pattern of human adaptation to challenging circumstances. Hornsby, usually a man of few words, revealed a philosophical nature that emerged when work demands were lighter and conversation flowed more freely. He had seen the frontier change dramatically during his years along the Missouri River, watching as peaceful coexistence between different peoples gave way to increasing suspicion and conflict. His observations about human nature were colored by experience rather than theory, offering Sarah insights into the complex forces that shaped frontier society. Little Bird's development provided daily entertainment and wonder. At 8 months old, she was beginning to show the personality traits that would define her character as she grew. She was fearless in exploring her environment, curious about everything within reach, and remarkably adaptable to the varying conditions of frontier life. Her laughter could brighten the darkest winter day, and her obvious contentment despite their uncertain circumstances reminded the adults that happiness was often more about attitude than external conditions. The isolation also gave Sarah time to reflect on the transformation she had undergone since Thomas's abandonment. The frightened, dependent woman who had been left at the trading post 6 months earlier had been replaced by someone who could split firewood, dress wounds, manage complex business transactions, and make difficult decisions under pressure. The change was not just practical, but fundamental, affecting how she saw herself and her place in the world. In December, a series of unusually warm days melted enough snow to make travel possible, bringing unexpected visitors to the trading post. Sarah was splitting kindling behind the main building when she heard the sound of approaching horses and recognized the distinctive jingle of military equipment. Her heart sank as she realized that Thomas had made good on his threat to involve authorities in his attempt to reclaim what he considered his property. Captain Morrison led a patrol of 6 soldiers, their blue uniforms stark against the white landscape. But his expression was grim rather than hostile as he dismounted and approached the trading post. Sarah noticed that he carried official-looking documents in his saddlebags, suggesting that this visit was more than a routine patrol. "Mrs. Mitchell," Morrison said, touching his hat in greeting. "Mr. Hornsby." "Miss Crow Dog." "Captain," Hornsby replied cautiously. "What brings you out in this weather?" Morrison's expression remained serious as he produced the documents from his saddlebags. "I'm afraid I have official business to conduct. There have been formal complaints filed regarding the activities at this trading post." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. Thomas had apparently been busy during the weeks since his departure, using whatever connections he possessed to create legal difficulties for the people he blamed for his failed marriage. "What kind of complaints?" Sarah asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite her internal turmoil. Morrison consulted his papers before responding. Allegations of unauthorized trading with hostile Indian tribes, harboring persons of mixed blood without proper documentation, and encouraging activities that might undermine American authority in this region. Those are serious charges, Hornsby said quietly. Do you have evidence to support them? The evidence is primarily testimonial, Morrison replied. Thomas Mitchell has provided detailed statements about activities he observed during his visit here. He claims that this trading post serves as a gathering point for Indians planning hostile actions against white settlements. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest at Thomas's willingness to fabricate lies in order to force her compliance with his demands. Thomas Mitchell is my estranged husband, she said firmly. He's attempting to use military authority to coerce me into returning to a marriage I've chosen to leave. Morrison nodded slowly. I suspected as much. Your husband's statements contained certain inconsistencies that suggested personal motivation rather than genuine concern for regional security. Then, why are you here with official papers? Martha asked, stepping forward with Little Bird in her arms. Morrison's expression softened slightly as he looked at the young mother and her baby. Because complaints have been filed, and I'm required to investigate them thoroughly. But I'm also required to report accurately on what I find, regardless of what the complainant might prefer. Sarah studied the captain's face, trying to determine whether his apparent sympathy was genuine or merely a tactical approach to gathering information that might be used against them. Military officers were skilled at reading people and situations, and Morrison had already demonstrated that his understanding of frontier realities was more sophisticated than many of his colleagues possessed. What exactly do you need to investigate? Hornsby asked. Morrison consulted his papers again. I need to verify your trading licenses and examine records of transactions with Indian customers. I need to document the status of all persons residing at this establishment. And I need to assess whether any activities here might reasonably be interpreted as encouraging Indian resistance to American authority. The investigation that followed was thorough, but conducted with professional courtesy rather than hostility. Morrison examined Hornsby's licenses and trading records, finding them in proper order. He questioned Sarah about her marital status and her reasons for remaining at the trading post, receiving answers that clearly contradicted Thomas's version of events. When Morrison interviewed Martha about her background and activities, Sarah was impressed by the young woman's composure under what was essentially an interrogation. Martha answered all questions directly and honestly, making no attempt to hide her mixed heritage or her connections to various Indian communities. Her obvious intelligence and dignity made it difficult for anyone to view her as a security threat. The captain also spent time observing the daily operations of the trading post, noting the respectful interactions between residents and the practical nature of work that occupied their time. Nothing he saw supported allegations of subversive activity or inappropriate relationships with potentially hostile Indian groups. On the second day of the investigation, a group of Mandan hunters arrived at the trading post seeking supplies for their winter hunt. Sarah watched Morrison carefully as Martha translated between the hunters and Hornsby, facilitating a transaction that benefited all parties involved. The Mandan exchanged furs and handcrafted items for ammunition, coffee, and metal tools they needed for survival during the harsh winter months. One of the hunters, an older man with weathered features and eyes that held depths of ancient wisdom, noticed Little Bird sleeping in Martha's arms. He spoke quietly to Martha in a language Sarah didn't recognize, then reached into his pack and withdrew a small carved wooden toy in the shape of a bear. The gift was offered with such genuine kindness that even Morrison seemed moved by the gesture. He says the bear will protect her dreams, Martha explained to Sarah, accepting the gift with obvious gratitude. His own granddaughter died of fever last winter, and he wants Little Bird to have something that will bring her good fortune. Sarah saw Morrison taking mental notes of this interaction, recognizing that the humanity displayed by the Mandan hunter was difficult to reconcile with stereotypes of savage hostility that often shaped military policies. The captain was witnessing firsthand the complex relationships that existed between different communities on the frontier, relationships that defied simple categorizations of friend or enemy. As the Mandan hunters prepared to leave, their leader approached Morrison directly, speaking in halting English supplemented by gestures and a few words of translation for Martha. He expressed concern about increasing tensions between his people and white settlers. He wanted the military to understand that the Mandan desired peace and were willing to share the land with newcomers if treated with fairness and respect. We are not warriors seeking battle, the hunter said through Martha's translation. We are fathers and grandfathers trying to provide for our families. The earth is large enough for all people if they are willing to live with wisdom rather than greed. Morrison listened to this message with obvious attention, asking questions that demonstrated both professional interest and personal curiosity about Mandan perspectives on regional tensions. The conversation that followed revealed the complex challenges facing Indian communities caught between traditional ways of life and the pressures of American expansion. When the hunters departed, Morrison sat quietly on the trading post porch for a long time, apparently deep in thought. Sarah watched him struggle with what appeared to be a conflict between his official responsibilities and his personal understanding of the situations he was required to evaluate. "Captain," Sarah said eventually, breaking the silence, "what will you report to your superiors?" Morrison looked at her with an expression that mixed professional duty with human sympathy. "I'll report that this trading post operates legally within federal guidelines and poses no security threat to American interests in this region. I'll also report that the allegations made by Thomas Mitchell appear to be motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate concerns about subversive activities." "And Martha? Will your report cause problems for her?" Morrison considered this question carefully before responding. "I'll report that Martha Crow Dog is a valuable resource for facilitating peaceful relations between white and Indian communities. I'll recommend that persons with her linguistic skills and cultural knowledge be recognized as assets rather than treated as security risks." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she recognized that Morrison's report might not end the challenges they faced. Thomas was capable of finding other ways to cause trouble, and the broader political pressures that shaped frontier policies would continue regardless of one military officer's recommendations. "There's something else you should know," Morrison continued. "Your husband has been making inquiries about legal options for forcing you to return to your marriage. He's consulted with lawyers in St. Louis about abandonment laws and property rights." The information was not entirely unexpected, but it still sent a chill through Sarah as she contemplated the possibility of being legally compelled to return to a man she no longer loved or respected. The law still heavily favored husbands in marital disputes, and women who left their marriages often found themselves with few legal protections. "What does that mean for me practically?" Sarah asked. Morrison hesitated before answering. "It means that if he can prove you've willingly abandoned your marital obligations, he might be able to force you to return or at least claim any property or earnings you've accumulated during your separation." The threat was real and serious, but Sarah found that it didn't shake her resolve as much as she might have expected. She had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed, and she was prepared to fight for the independence she had earned through her own efforts. "Then, I'll deal with those challenges when they come," Sarah said firmly. "I won't be intimidated into returning to a marriage that was destroying both of us." That evening, as Morrison and his soldiers prepared to leave the next morning, Sarah found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed since Thomas's abandonment 6 months earlier. The frightened, dependent woman who had been left at the trading post had been replaced by someone who could face legal threats, military investigations, and uncertain futures with confidence in her own abilities. Martha joined her on the porch as they watched the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Little Bird slept peacefully in her mother's arms, clutching the wooden bear that had been given to her by the Mandan hunter. "Are you worried about what Thomas might do next?" Martha asked. Sarah considered the question before responding. "I'm concerned, but not worried," she said finally. "Thomas can create difficulties for us, but he can't force me to become someone I'm not. I've learned too much about myself to go back to being the person I was when he left me here. And if the law requires you to return to him, then I'll find ways to resist that law. There are places beyond the reach of courts and legal papers, places where people like us can make new lives without interference from others." Martha smiled at Sarah's words, recognizing the determination that had helped both women survive challenges that would have defeated them if they had faced them alone. Their friendship had become a source of strength for both of them, providing support that transcended differences in background and experience. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A messenger arrived from Fort Leavenworth with word that Thomas Mitchell had been killed 3 days earlier when his horse fell through thin ice while crossing a creek near Kansas City. The accident had been witnessed by other travelers, who confirmed that Thomas had been traveling alone and that his death was clearly accidental rather than the result of foul play. Sarah received the news with complex emotions. She felt no grief for Thomas, but neither did she feel satisfaction at his death. Instead, she experienced something like relief that the threat he represented had been resolved without requiring her to compromise her principles or endanger the people she cared about. The practical implications of widowhood were significant. As Thomas's legal widow, Sarah would inherit whatever property he had possessed, including the wagon and supplies he had taken when he abandoned her. More importantly, she would be free from the legal constraints that had threatened to force her back into an unwanted marriage. Morrison, who had delayed his departure when the messenger arrived, offered to help Sarah navigate the legal complexities of inheritance and ensure that her rights as Thomas's widow were properly protected. His assistance was both practical and symbolic, representing military recognition of her legitimacy as an independent frontier woman. Spring came early that year, bringing with it the return of river traffic and overland travelers. The trading post emerged from winter isolation to resume its role as a crucial link in the network of commerce that connected frontier communities with the larger world. Sarah and Martha had proven their ability to manage the establishment through the most challenging season, earning Hornsby's complete confidence in their capabilities. The changes in Sarah's legal status also brought new opportunities. As a widow with inherited property, she had resources that could be invested in expanding the trading post's operations. She proposed becoming Hornsby's partner rather than simply his employee, contributing her inheritance to improve facilities and expand inventory in exchange for share profits. The partnership proved beneficial for all concerned. Sarah's organizational skills and Martha's cultural knowledge combined to make the trading post one of the most successful commercial establishments on that stretch of the Missouri River. They attracted customers from diverse communities who knew they would be treated fairly regardless of their background or circumstances. Little Bird grew into a bright, curious toddler who was equally comfortable with white customers and Indian visitors. Her easy acceptance of diversity reflected the inclusive environment that Sarah and Martha had worked to create, demonstrating that different cultures could coexist peacefully when people approached each other with respect and understanding. By midsummer, the transformation was complete. Sarah had evolved from abandoned wife to successful businesswoman, from dependent victim to confident leader. The trading post that had once been her refuge had become her home and her future. She had found not just survival, but purpose in helping to create a place where different peoples could meet as equals. One evening, as she watched the Missouri River flow past on its eternal journey toward the sea, Sarah thought about the debris that current carried away and the seeds it deposited on distant shores. She had been both debris and seed, washed up on these banks by forces beyond her control, but taking root and growing into something stronger than what she had been before. The river continued its ancient flow, indifferent to human hopes and fears. But Sarah had learned that people, unlike rivers, could choose their directions. She had chosen to build rather than simply survive, to include rather than exclude, to grow rather than diminish in response to life's challenges. Her story had begun with abandonment and tears, but it had become something much larger, a testament to the possibility of transformation, the power of friendship across cultural boundaries, and the strength that emerges when people have the courage to live according to their own values rather than others' expectations. The frontier continued to change around them, bringing new challenges and opportunities with each passing season. But Sarah faced the future with confidence, knowing that she had discovered not just how to survive in this harsh land, but how to thrive by creating community where none had existed before.